Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lindsay Newton. I am the Director of Community Engagement at the Missouri Historical Society. And on behalf of MHS, I would like to welcome you to STL History Live this afternoon. Thank you for joining us virtually today. I know that some of you watching today are Missouri Historical Society members. Thank you. We are always grateful for your support. And if you are not a member, we would love for you to consider joining today. You can visit our website, www.mohistory.org/support. And in a few moments, I will put that address in our chat box so you can see a link. We also sincerely thank city and county residents for your tax contributions through the Zoo Museum Tax District. All of this support is greatly appreciated, especially during this time as we work from home. Just to let you know how things will go today, this will be a roughly 25-minute presentation followed by 10 minutes for Q&A. You can submit questions through the Q&A button in your toolbar, and we would prefer you wait until the end to ask your questions, just so that we make sure we see them. Please know that we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible, but we may not have time to get to all of them, and there is a way for us to follow up with you if you had a question that we didn't get back to. And lastly, closed captioning is being provided today. So to turn it on, you can scroll to the closed caption button along the toolbar on your screen. So now I'm going to turn this over to our speaker. Today's talk, The Forgotten Story of Mexican St. Louis, 1880 to 1930, is presented by Daniel Gonzalez, who is the Director of Exhibitions Research at the Indiana Historical Society. I know you will enjoy.
All right. Thanks, Lindsay. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in for this. And thank you to the Missouri Historical Society for telling these stories, for providing these resources. This is a first for me doing a presentation online, but I think it's a great way to keep some historical discussions going while we're stuck at home. So my presentation today is entitled The Forgotten History, The Forgotten Story of Mexican St. Louis, 1880 to 1930. So we're looking at sort of an extended early 20th century. I wanted to start this, and I thought it was appropriate to start this with a little discussion about the title. Why are these stories forgotten? And truth be told, they're not forgotten by everybody. In the process of doing this research, was lucky enough to do some interviews with members of families who came to St. Louis. They or their family members came to St. Louis as early as the 1920s. For these families, the story is not forgotten. What I mean by this title, A Forgotten Story, is that when we discuss the broader narrative of St. Louis, the story of Mexican immigration, the story of St. Louis's connection with Mexico is often forgotten or overlooked. So I think this is a good opportunity to share some of those stories. And I hope that you guys will find that those stories are captivating, fascinating, but also important in changing how you look at and understand the broader narrative of the city. So we'll go to the next slide. And I told you guys that this was going to be a presentation about 1880 to 1930, and already I'm lying to you guys. I'm sorry, but I need to go back a little bit further to provide some context, because the relationship between St. Louis and Mexico that will lead to immigration really begins with trade, and that trade goes back to the 1830s when you have this collapse of the American fur trade, and St. Louis is a city established for the trading of furs as a trading outpost is looking for a new direction. And they find that new direction in the Southwest. A lot of trade developed along the Santa Fe Trail. And so in terms of commerce and in terms of the military at Jefferson Barracks, St. Louis becomes sort of the tip of the spear for imperialist entry into the Southwest. And this is going to bring significant relationships and interactions between Hispanic traders in the Southwest and traders in St. Louis. So we can still go back a slide. I want to talk about the images there. The couple of things are happening with these relationships. One is it's bringing some of these traders to St. Louis for school. One example here is there's an image of a building there that says Otero Cellar and Company. So this was one of the largest merchandising businesses in the Southwest. It was established by Miguel Otero in partnership with a Scottish immigrant, John Perry Cellar. And Otero actually came to St. Louis and attended private school here as a young man and graduated from St. Louis University in 1841. He is a great example of one of the major causes for early Mexican immigrants to come to St. Louis. That is access to high quality education, higher education. The picture of the three men here, the man standing is Saren St. Vrain, who will be one of the largest landowners in St. Louis, owned a good chunk of what is now Spanish Lake in St. Louis County. He sort of shares another story, another way in which these relationships develop, and that is familial ties. Saren St. Vrain's sister marries the man sitting on the right, and that is Jose Valadez, and his business partner, Saren St. Vrain's business partner, Charles Bent, marries a Latino woman. The relationship between these traders was fraught from the beginning. There's always this underpinning that these relationships are surrounded by the fact that there is an imperialist agenda, that the United States is sent on westward expansion, on taking control of lands that are Mexico and lands that are owned by many of these traders. So there are negative racial attitudes, negative bigoted perspectives. Charles Bent, who married a Latina woman, expresses some of those. He's quoted as saying, "There is no stability in these people," referencing Latinos. They have no opinion of their own. They are entirely governed by the powers that be. They are without exception the most servile people that can be imagined. An interesting perspective, because ultimately Charles Bent is going to be overthrown by residents of the Southwest when he serves as one of the first governors in the New Mexico territory. On the reverse, there's a lot of distrust on the part of Hispanic traders. Miguel Otero is quoted as telling his son that he should go to St. Louis and learn the language and find ways to come back and protect Latinos in the Southwest. So this is sort of the underpinning. This relationship develops and enriches people on both sides, but ultimately there is this tension from the very beginning. We can go to the next slide now. The post-Civil War period is going to develop these trading ties even further. And these trading ties are driven by the fact that this country is devastated by the Civil War. And St. Louis is looking for opportunities for new trading partners to develop trade further with existing trading partners. And so they look to Mexico. And three things happen that are really important, and they're all driven by the man pictured here, and his name is John F. Cahill. He is not Latino. He did live in Cuba, though, and so knew the language and was able to serve this trading in that way. So the three things. First, he establishes a newspaper, El Comercio del Valle, in 1876. It's claimed to be the largest U.S. paper in Mexico by 1884, with a circulation of 12,000 people. The second thing that happens is he's named Mexican consulate in St. Louis in 1878. And the third thing is he establishes a Mexican and Spanish American mercantile exchange in 1883. This building is the one pictured here. The headquarters of the newspaper is also in the same building. And it was located at 8th and Olive in downtown St. Louis. And unfortunately, the building's no longer there. But we do have this nice illustration of it. By 1895, St. Louis was a leader in trade with Mexico, with receipts totaling $7.5 million. and that is a leader in terms of American cities. So in the process of developing these trading relationships, these ties, they're laying literal ties in the form of railroads. A lot of those are headquartered in St. Louis and will ultimately create the physical connections between St. Louis and Mexico that are going to be required to facilitate large-scale immigration. We can go to the next slide then. Some of the earliest immigrants to St. Louis were folks who were very wealthy. As I mentioned, they came to attend St. Louis University or Washington University or Christian Brothers College. Some came for a really unique purpose that had a huge effect, dramatic effect on the overall outcome of the Mexican Revolution. So right here in St. Louis, having this impact on the Mexican Revolution, sort of a remarkable thing. Now, I will mention that these folks were members of the Mexican Liberal Party, and they made their headquarters in St. Louis in the years prior to the Mexican Revolution. In St. Louis, though, they were dubbed the St. Louis Junta by the Post-Dispatch, and huge focus was placed on them by the media. There was a fascination. You can see on here, this is a excerpt from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, huge illustrations demonstrating the interest or importance of this story. Members of the Mexican Liberal Party published a newspaper called Regeneración that was distributed across Mexico. The thoughts, the ideas that were promoted in there, primarily by Ricardo and Enrique Flores Magón, were central to establishing the idea that the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz in Mexico should be overthrown, and influenced later leaders of the Mexican Revolution, folks like Francisco Madero. So in St. Louis, we're having this direct connection to international events. The smaller insert picture on there is a photo of the home that the members of the Mexican Liberal Party occupied at 107 North Channing Avenue, which is a street that doesn't exist anymore, and the home is no longer standing, but it's near where St. Louis University is today. So the Mexican Revolution that these folks in St. Louis are helping to precipitate is ultimately going to lead to a breakdown in trade because of the chaos of the Mexican Revolution. But it's also going to result in the beginning of large-scale immigration to the Midwest and to St. Louis for our particular story. So we can go to the next slide. So there's this push and pull that's going to happen, as typically happens in immigration stories. The push, as we talked about, is the Mexican Revolution and the chaos and poverty that is the result of that. But the pull is a labor shortage here in St. Louis that is a result of several immigration acts in the United States that are going to dramatically reduce the number of Southern and Eastern Europeans that are able to immigrate. The labor that those immigrants provided was still needed. And so employers are looking elsewhere, and they look to Mexico because these communities in North America were exempted from many of these immigration laws. They're finding work on the railroads, in industrial jobs, and they're actually being recruited to St. Louis by a few employment agencies that are centralized along Market Street in downtown St. Louis. So these employment agencies are bringing folks to St. Louis, but they're also working to find opportunities for these immigrants in cities across the Midwest and beyond, in Chicago, in Detroit, all the way to Pittsburgh, all the way to Pennsylvania. They are helping to establish, in some ways, the nucleuses, the beginnings of Mexican colonies in these different areas, a peopling of the Midwest by Mexican immigrants. And so St. Louis has the, the nickname of being the gateway to the West for many Mexican immigrants, St. Louis becomes the gateway to the east as they move into the Midwest and beyond. The employment agencies, Griswold and Model Employment Agencies. The Model Employment Agency, according to one report, brought through St. Louis as many as 10,000 Mexican immigrants in 1927 alone. So a huge movement of folks. In St. Louis, the folks who are staying and settling here are not concentrating in one particular neighborhood, as you see in a lot of other places. Instead, there's sort of a disparate pattern of settlement, but there are a few areas that are worth noting. Certainly, the Metro East in Granite City and other locations over there, there is a group that begins finding employment and residency. In St. Louis City proper, across the south side, but centralized around Soulard and Kosciuszko neighborhood today on the city's south side, and also in the Baden neighborhood on the city's north side. These were places where you might find larger concentrations of Mexican immigrants in the 1920s. We can go to the next slide here. So this is an image of a home that was built by one family of Mexican immigrants in the 1920s. On the north side, there was the establishment of a boxcar community, a number of Mexican immigrants who, many of which were likely working as railroad employees, and then ultimately took up residency on the north side of St. Louis, living in boxcars. In this case, this family was not living in a boxcar, but this home was built using excess wood and railroad ties from the railroad. So this family and the couple is pictured in the top there, and it looks like the husband might have might be cut off a little bit. But this is Agustin and Jesus Zuniga, and I was able to interview their son, Gus Zuniga, and hear a little bit about their story. Gus actually spent his first few years living in this makeshift home on the city's north side. Ultimately, the family was able to weather depression because his father was able to find work with the Terminal Railroad. And Gus talked about having to go from the north side down to where his father was working near Union Station, and deliver food on days when his father had to work multiple shifts, able to in between those. Ultimately, the family was able to move from this home into a home in Hyde Park. Gus attended school at Hadley Technical Academy and studied drafting. And he was able to be one of the first employees of the architecture firm HOK, one of the leaders of the company. And that company, that architecture firm, was one of the in the country, and certainly helped to reshape the landscape St. Louis City and cities across the country. We can go to the next slide here. So residencies were established in a disparate pattern. A number of institutions are connected to or established to the Mexican community in St. Louis. The building pictured here is a church, a Catholic church called Our Lady of Covadonga. And it was established in 1912 as a Spanish language mission, really targeted white Spaniards primarily. But by 1915, the mission acquired its own building. And at that point, 30% of the congregation were Mexicans, including the two priests who were in charge of the church. They were Mexican refugees who themselves had fled the Mexican. The church established was initially built as a Methodist church, and then when the Methodist church constructed a new building, it was used for this purpose. It's still standing today, this building. It's at the corner of Virginia and Blow, and it's still used as a church, at least when I last checked, and it was called the Carondelet Christian Center. So one of the landmarks of early Mexican community that is still standing. We can go to the next slide now. These communities also established organizations, and perhaps this was in part driven by disparate patterns of settlement. They were looking for ways to connect with their culture and identity and mutual benefit. And they did. These organizations provided help to finding employment, finding housing. They provided assistance to folks from Mexico who were passing through, perhaps needed a place to stay or guidance in some way. The first one that was formed was the Mexican Benefit Society in the early 1920s, which was followed in the next decade by the Benito Juarez Society in 1936. The two organizations actually merged in 1945 and continued into the 2000s, I believe. I mean, they continued until the very recent past. One additional organization was founded on in the Metro East called the Mexican Honorary Commission, and it was founded in 1926. And this group is still in operation today. Okay, we'll go to the next slide here. So the last part of my story, we're coming into the late 1920s, and the Mexican community by this point has established itself. It's been in St. Louis for at least a decade or more in significant number. And the for this community are really hard to gauge, and there's a few reasons for that. One is the census does not provide an accurate accounting. The reason for that is perhaps because this community moved around quite a bit, but it also do with the story I'm going to tell you about the struggle that the Mexican community is going to face in the 1930s. And that is that when the Great Depression begins, discrimination against Mexicans escalates into a national effort of repatriation and deportation. This is a nationally encouraged movement that is ultimately orchestrated and executed at the state and local level. It occurs across the country, and ultimately hundreds of thousands of Mexican immigrants, but also Mexican Americans, folks who were born in the United States, are forced out of the country. In St. Louis, this takes the form of repatriation, which is a voluntary removal or a voluntary movement back to your country of origin. This term is maybe misleading in this case because it was really a coerced repatriation. What was happening was the opportunities to work were eliminated as employers prioritized native-born or white individuals to receive jobs. Compounding the difficulty is many forms of relief were not available to Mexican immigrants or the Mexican community. On top of that, they were induced by reduced rail fare offered by the Missouri Pacific, as well as other rail lines, saying that if they got on the train and didn't get off until they returned to Mexico, that the fare, the cost of that train trip would be cut in half. All of these things combined to create a condition where many Mexican immigrants saw little choice but to remove and go back to Mexico. In doing so, our best estimates is that as much as half of the Mexican population in St. Louis was removed in this time period. And so it marks a bookend for the first major wave of Mexican immigrants to St. Louis, a story that begins with these massive trading ties connecting these two cities, bringing wealthy Mexicans, elite Mexicans to the city for schooling, for commercial ties, and ultimately resulting in the establishment of these employment agencies, the settlement of thousands of Mexicans in St. Louis to work on the railroad, to work in factories, to help build St. Louis commercially and economically. But while this is the end of the first chapter, perhaps, of the Mexican St. Louis, it is far from the end of the story of Mexicans in St. Louis, a story that continues to be written into today. We'll go to my final slide here. And again, I'm going a little beyond the 1930 end point of this story, just to make note that this is the beginning of a story that continues, and the next chapters matter just as much as the ones I've gone through. The pictures I've shown here are just meant to give an illustration. They show the work of migrant and seasonal farm workers in West County communities like Chesterfield. They show early restaurants like the ones located in Midtown in the city, as well as out in Florissant and across the region, really. And shows pictures of celebrations along Cherokee Street, which has become not just a Mexican commercial center, but a broader Latino commercial center in the modern era. So started by talking about how this is a forgotten history and the reasons why that might be. I want to end by expressing why it should be re-remembered, perhaps, by folks who don't know this story, by folks who are helping to create the broader narrative that we tell about ourselves in St. Louis. And that is that, on a very base level, this is an important story in understanding the development of St. Louis commercially, economically, politically. It shows the connections between St. Louis and goings on nationally and internationally. But perhaps more important than that, this story is one of a community that continues to grow in St. Louis. And it's really important that as we create narratives about our city, about our region, that we include the stories of all the people who contributed and made St. Louis what St. Louis is today. So I hope that we can take these stories, include them in the narratives that we tell, share them with as many folks as possible, and really try and make sure that these forgotten histories are no longer forgotten, and then I can change the name of my presentation. So that concludes my remarks, and at this point, I'll open it up for folks to ask questions that they might have, and I'll try and answer them if I can. The first question is from David Brown, and he's commenting very accurately that there is a significant population in Fairmont City and lots of terrific restaurants too. That a lot of them were left over from initial waves of immigration. Would a lot of them have worked in the stockyards over there? Definitely, that's definitely possible. A lot of them were working on the east side, primarily in industrial jobs, attracted by the large number of factories and that sort of work that was going on, as well as railroad work. In terms of the stockyards, there's a lot of research that remains to be done on this topic. And what I've found, I think, represents sort of the tip of the iceberg in terms of what can be discovered. So I haven't done any digging into the presence of Mexican immigration in the stockyards, but it wouldn't surprise me at all to find a presence there. The next question is there a distinction between the term Mexican versus Latino? And the answer is yes, there's a distinction. Latino is a term that is meant to speak about a broad group of people that includes all folks who are coming from, who live in Latin American countries. So this is distinguished from the term Hispanic because to be Latino, you don't have to be a Spanish-speaking country. It's geographically based, whereas Hispanic includes Spain, Latino does not include Spain, and whereas whereas Latino includes Brazil, Hispanic would not because of the language that they speak there. Mexican then is a more specific term for folks who are coming from the country of Mexico. So Mexicans Mexican Americans are Latino, but not all Latinos are Mexican, if that makes sense. Let's see. Mention the house. It says, you mentioned that the house on Channing Street, the street that no longer exists, was near St. Louis University, was a part of the Mill Creek Valley neighborhood. I think it was a little further north than Mill Creek, but I'd have to check the map to see. Let's see. Getting a little behind here. Let's see. Sorry, guys, I got a little out of place here. I'll just go from where I am here. The boxcar communities along what railroads did these become further integral migration points as workers spread out along the railroad lines to other communities? I think this is a really good question. I mean, in the only boxcar community in St. Louis that I know of is that one that was located in the on the extreme north side, but there may have been others. And I think as folks got more established in St. Louis, they moved out of those communities. So I don't know for sure when the boxcar community dissipated, but my understanding is that it wasn't a long-lasting community, that these folks were not living there for decades and decades. So in terms of, did these become further internal migration points as workers spread out? If I'm understanding correctly, I don't think that these became sort of central points for the community, if that makes sense. I think they were starting off points. So if I didn't totally understand that question, follow up and I can try and clarify. The Mexican Benefit Society on the east side was the Mexican Honorary Commission. So why were there no Mexican restaurants in St. Louis until the 70s? There were Mexican restaurants prior to the 70s. There's a good report, and I'd have to look at what the exact date on it is. I want to say it's like the 20s or 30s, or maybe just a little bit later. And they talk about a Mexican restaurant in the city of St. Louis. It's interesting because they go on and they describe the food there and everything, but they don't mention the name of the restaurant. And I haven't been able to figure out what the name of that restaurant is. Okay. What about the development of the term Hispanic coming out of US Census versus within our communities? Yeah, I mean, I think one of the really interesting things about the Latino community, about the Hispanic community, whatever name folks are using, is folks, there's just a challenge, I guess, in terms of who gets to decide what these communities get called, and each individual has perhaps a preference on what terminology gets used. So Hispanic and Latino are certainly some of the most common, but my father prefers the term Chicano, and in more recent years, Latinx is used as a non-gendered term, and so all of those have. But yeah, Hispanic is a good example of a way in which it's not the community itself that is defining what they're going to be called in the United States, but the federal government or governmental entities. Yeah, Ruiz Mexican Restaurant is the oldest, according to my research, is the oldest still operating Mexican restaurant in the St. Louis region, in St. Louis County and St. Louis City. So very cool part of our history here. does it make sense to include Spaniards in the category of Hispanic, or in the category? What category are we talking about there? Yeah, one of the experience of folks who are immigrating from Spain is definitely different than the folks who are immigrating from Mexico. And there are distinctions that go beyond that within the Latino community. The experience of Mexican immigrants is distinct from immigrants from Cuba or people from Puerto Rico. So there's a lot of difference within Hispanic communities or within Latino communities in terms of experience. And it does, with the discussion of Spain in particular, raise some questions about how these groups are identified and organized. So Spain would be included under the umbrella of Hispanic, because as I understand, Hispanic is a delineation that's driven by shared language. So because it's a Spanish-speaking country. The Boxcar community located on the extreme northeast side, I'll have to check and see what railroad company that was owned by. I don't know off the top of my head. But Antonio, I think I've got your contact information, so I can look that up. I've got it in my notes, and I can share that with you. See, I'm going back to see if I missed questions here.
We can probably do one more question if anybody has one more, or if there's one we've missed.
Barbara C. Peterson asked a really good question. Are they Hispanic even though their native language is Basque and not Spanish? That's a great question, and not an expertise that I have in terms of defining how those folks would be grouped, but that is an interesting question, one I hadn't thought about. Yeah, Annie?
All right. Well, Danny, thank you so much for sharing this history with us today. I know it means a lot to our community. And thank you all viewers for tuning in today. We would, of course, love for you to join us next time. I'm going to show the slide that shows a few of our upcoming presentations next week. Tuesday is our very next presentation, and we will feature a discussion about turning points in St. Louis LGBTQIA+ history. You can visit mohistory.org or Facebook to see more about these events that are coming up in the STL History Live series. And lastly, I just want to say that your feedback is always really important to us. It helps us make decisions about how we offer programs for you all. We would really appreciate it if you could take our short survey. So a Kobo Toolbox survey should have opened on another browser tab for you while we have been watching today. So as you leave today, just keep an eye out for that tab, Kobo Toolbox. And if you could take a couple minutes to fill it out, we would, again, really appreciate that. Thank you all for joining us today. We'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.